The prairie lay silent beneath the weight of winter, its wide expanse dimming into a grey dusk that pressed against the earth like a heavy hand. Snow drifted across the barren fields, piling against fences that leaned with age, filling wagon ruts until they vanished, smoothing every scar of the land into one unbroken sheet of white. The air bit with a cruel sharpness, the kind that cracked wood and stiffened breath before it could turn to steam. Elias' car moved slowly inside the cabin he had built with his own hands, its timbers groaning under the strain of wind. The stove ticked as it cooled, though its fire never truly went out. It was the one sound, besides the creak of the old rocking chair, that kept him company. That chair had once held his wife, her shawl forever slipping from her shoulders as she read scripture or mended seams. Now it sat empty, the shawl still draped across its back, gathering the faint scent of smoke but nothing of her warmth. Elias never touched it. Some things were not meant to be disturbed. The loneliness had grown into a companion of its own, silent and patient, gnawing on him day by day. He ate from tin plates, spoke to no one, and moved like a man who did not care whether his own shadow followed. The land was his only company, the fox tracks at the edge of the barn, the groan of the windmill, the muted cry of coyotes too thin to hunt. He had accepted this as his life, empty, spare, without surprise. Then came the knock. It was sharp against the door, startling him in a way few things did anymore. The wind howled so fierce he thought he had imagined it, until it came again, 3 quick raps, urgent but not desperate. Elias rose, joints stiff, and crossed the room with the slow certainty of a man who did not welcome interruption. He unbarred the door, and the storm breathed into his home. On the threshold stood a girl, or no, a young woman, though her frame was so slight she might have been mistaken for less. Her hair, dark and wet with snow, clung to her cheeks. A thin shawl, soaked through, hung from her shoulders, and her fingers, half clenched, bore the pale purple of frost. She did not plead with words. Her eyes, black as midnight, spoke enough. Elias studied her a long while, the snow swirling between them. She was Apache. He knew it from the cut of her cheekbones, the way she stood, proud even in her shivering. He had seen women like her only from a distance, often with soldiers' rifles aimed in between. And now one stood at his door, wordless, without weapon, her breath sharp and ragged in the frozen air. He could have closed the door. He told himself he ought to. It was not his place to take her in, not his burden. Folks in town would call him a fool, or worse. Yet his hand did not move. He saw in her eyes something he knew too well, the hollow of abandonment, the deep wound of being left with nothing. He stepped aside. "Get in before the storm kills you," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. She crossed into the warmth without a word, her shawl dripping onto the floorboards. Elias shut the door, barring out the cold, though not the unease that settled with her presence. He motioned toward the chair opposite the stove, then busied himself with the fire, shoving another log onto the embers until sparks leapt up and the cabin filled with their hiss. The silence between them thickened. He filled a tin cup with coffee gone bitter from reheating, placed it on the table without looking at her. She wrapped her fingers around it, though she did not drink at once. The steam rose into her face, softening her expression just enough to reveal how close she had been to breaking. Elias sat across from her, his plate empty, his rifle leaning against the wall. He told himself it was only for the night. By morning, the storm would ease, and she would be on her way. He needed no company. He wanted no change. But as he watched her sip carefully, her hands trembling as if each swallow anchored her to life, he felt the cabin shift around them. The storm battered the shutters, rattled the roof. Within, there was only the scrape of her cup against tin, the crackle of the logs, the slow, uneven breathing of two souls who had nothing but silence to keep them alive. When the fire dipped low, she pulled her shawl tighter and lowered her eyes. Not in shame, not in fear, but in the mute hope of someone who had dared to knock on a stranger's door because there was nowhere else left. Elias leaned back, arms crossed, staring at the rafters. He told himself again she would leave come dawn. Yet deep in the marrow of that long night, something stirred, a seed, buried under years of frost, feeling the faintest touch of warmth. He did not welcome it. He only knew it was there. The storm did not pass in a single night. Snow lingered along the ridges and gullies for weeks, and with it lingered the woman Elias had allowed across his threshold. He had expected her to vanish at first light, leaving behind only the damp print of her boots on his floor. Yet each morning, when he rose to stoke the fire and break the ice in the water bucket, she was still there, silent, watching him, moving through the cabin like a shadow that had grown roots. Her name came reluctantly, one evening spoken in a voice so low he almost thought the fire had whispered it, Anika. He repeated it once, awkward on his tongue, then never said it again. Some names, he knew, carried whole histories inside them, and hers was not his to probe. Days folded into one another. Elias found his gaze drawn, against his will, to the small ways she stitched herself into the place. She mended a torn shirt of his with thread finer than he kept on hand, her brown fingers moving quickly, sure of themselves. She swept the floorboards with the old broom that had stood untouched in the corner, gathering dust and splinters into a neat pile. She set a pot to simmer with dried beans, stirring slowly, her face bent to the steam. Each act tugged at him. He could almost hear his late wife's laugh, see the braid she used to coil over her shoulder, feel the warmth of her sitting by the stove with her shawl drawn close. The shawl still lay over the rocking chair, untouched, but now he caught Anika's glance upon it too, respectful, cautious, as though she sensed the spirit that lingered there. Elias wrestled with the unease of it. He had told himself his home was a place for silence and work, not for echoes of family life. Yet Anika's presence brought those ghosts alive again, and with them came a grief he had thought hardened into stone. Beyond the cabin walls, the land thawed. Snow melted into ruts of mud, and neighbors began their slow circuits once more. Word traveled faster than wagons. Before long, Elias noticed the sidelong glances at the trading post, the muttered jokes half swallowed when he passed. Car's got himself a wild girl. Shame a decent man don't know better. Warnings not spoken kindly, but edged with threat. He carried the weight of their words back home, where Anika was crouched near the hearth, feeding sticks into the coals. He studied her as though for the first time, the slope of her shoulders, the scar at her temple, the set of her jaw. He thought of the life she must have fled, raids, soldiers, losses beyond what he could name. She carried her pain without complaint, just as he carried his. Two exiles, sheltering beneath one roof. Yet he feared what his neighbors might do with their talk. That night he lay awake on his narrow bed, staring at the beams overhead. He thought of sending her away, not out of malice but out of a twisted sense of protection. Better the cold claim her than men with crueler intentions. The thought hollowed him. Anika must have felt it. She moved softly after midnight, wrapping her thin shawl around her, gathering what little she had brought. Elias heard the scrape of the latch, the whisper of cold air as the door opened. He rose without knowing why, his body carrying him across the floor before his mind could frame the words. There she stood in the threshold, her back to him, her hair unbraided and heavy with the night. She did not turn, did not plead. She only stood as one already accustomed to leaving, as though the world had taught her there was no place to remain. Elias reached past her and pushed the door shut. The sound of the latch falling into place echoed like a vow. He said nothing more. His hand lingered a moment on the wood, then fell away. Anika did not move, her breath unsteady. At last she stepped back from the door, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. She carried her silence back to the corner near the fire, where she sat and stared into the coals. Elias returned to his bed, though sleep never came. The cabin seemed different now, the air heavier, the walls drawn closer. He had closed the door not only against the night but against the part of himself that longed for emptiness. He did not know what it meant yet, only that he had chosen it. When dawn came, pale light cutting through the frost on the windows, the two of them sat across from each other at the rough-hewn table. He poured coffee, she tore bread into small pieces. No words were spoken. But something unspoken bound them, the knowledge that both had tried to walk away from life, and both had found, for now, reason to remain. The storm rolled in without warning, thick curtains of white swallowing the horizon until sky and earth became one. Wind howled across the prairie, scouring the cabin walls and forcing snow through the smallest cracks. Elias braced the shutters, nailed planks across the weakest seams, and set the stove roaring until the iron glowed red. Anika moved quietly behind him, laying quilts along the door, gathering every scrap of cloth to keep the drafts at bay. Their movements, though separate, fell into rhythm, as though survival had bound them to a shared pulse. By nightfall the rafters groaned with the weight of snow, and the cabin seemed smaller than ever. The wind screamed, beating against the walls like fists. Elias sat at the table, oil lamp throwing shadows across his weathered face. Anika mended a torn sleeve, her hair loose down her back, lit only by the flicker of flame. The silence between them felt less empty now, filled with the hush of work and the storm's unrelenting voice. Then came another knock. It startled them both. Elias set down his knife, hand moving instinctively toward the rifle in the corner. The sound came again, muffled by the wind, steady, insistent. He opened the door a crack, snow blasting into the room, and found a man standing there. The stranger was tall, his coat ragged, his hat brim iced over. He smiled as though they were old friends. "Storm will kill a man if he stays out," he said, his voice easy but his eyes sharp. Elias studied him a moment, then stepped aside. Hospitality was hard-earned out here, but refusing it could damn a man's soul as quick as the cold. The drifter stamped snow from his boots, nodded at Elias, and then let his gaze drift to Anika. It lingered too long. She lowered her eyes to the stitching in her lap, her hands suddenly unsteady. Elias felt the air shift, taut as a rope drawn across a chasm. They sat around the fire, the three of them, with the storm pressing its face to every seam of the cabin. The stranger spoke often, words spilling like whiskey, boasts of fights he had won, towns he had drifted through, women who had kept him company. His laughter was coarse, filling the room until it crowded out the quieter sounds of the night. Elias listened, his face unreadable, answering only when pressed. His words were few, clipped, and when he spoke of loss he did not speak of it directly, but the absence in his tone was louder than any story. Anika said nothing. She sat near the hearth, the orange glow painting her cheek, her dark eyes fixed on the fire. The stranger's gaze wandered to her again and again, hungry in its stillness. Elias noticed. His hand rested on the table, not far from where the rifle leaned. Hours passed. The storm thickened, shaking the cabin, driving snow against the roof like nails. The stranger shifted closer to the fire, then closer still, until his hand reached toward Anika's shawl where it lay loose at her side. Elias rose. He did not shout. He did not curse. He only stepped between them, his frame filling the space, his silence heavier than iron. The drifter froze, his smile faltering into something meaner, colder. Their eyes locked. For a long moment the storm outside seemed to hush, listening. Finally the stranger leaned back, forcing a laugh. "Didn't mean nothing." Elias said nothing, but he did not move from his place until the man's hand returned to his own lap. Anika's breath shivered in her throat, though she kept her eyes down. The night dragged on. The stranger grew restless, muttering, pacing the room in short circles like a wolf confined. Elias never let his guard drop, his shadow stretching long against the wall, his silence a wall of its own. By dawn, pale light seeped through cracks in the shuttered window. The storm began to break, leaving a brittle hush behind. The stranger pulled on his wet coat, his movements quick, jerky. At the door he paused, casting Elias a hard look, his voice low. "You'll regret this, old man." Then he stepped into the snow, his figure swallowed by the empty white. The door shut. The latch fell into place. For a long while Elias stood there, one hand pressed to the wood as though holding the storm itself at bay. Behind him, Anika stirred. She lifted her eyes to him, wide, uncertain, but carrying something new, something more than gratitude, less than trust, but heavier than either. She had seen him stand for her without asking, without question. To her, he was no longer just a reluctant shelter from the cold. He was a wall against the world's cruelty, even if he had not chosen to be. Elias did not meet her gaze. He went to the stove, added another log, and let the fire swell. Yet in his chest, where grief had lived undisturbed, another feeling pressed, unwanted, unspoken, but undeniable, like the first thaw of spring beneath the snow. The memory of the drifter clung to the cabin like the scent of smoke after a fire. Elias said little of it, but he moved differently now, always with the rifle close, always watching the tree line as he worked. When he sharpened tools on the whetstone, the rasp of steel was sharper, longer, as if he were honing more than just the edge of a blade. The stranger's promise, "You'll regret this, old man," hung in the silence between him and Anika, though neither spoke of it. Spring thaw came slow. The snow melted into the creek, leaving behind mud and the first hints of green. Anika began slipping outside in the mornings, planting herbs near the porch in careful rows. Her shawl fluttered in the thawing wind, her fingers dark with earth, patient in their labor. Elias found himself watching her from the fence line, his chest heavy with a mixture of things he had no name for. Inside, the cabin changed. The air no longer smelled of loneliness alone, but of herbs drying above the stove, bread baking in the cast-iron pot, wood newly split and stacked. Their days fell into rhythm, he tending the stock and fences, she tending the hearth and garden. Sometimes they spoke, brief words about weather or chores, but more often they worked in silence, each aware of the other's nearness. It should have been a comfort. Instead, guilt gnawed at Elias. Nights he lay awake staring at the rocking chair draped with his late wife's shawl, shame pressed on him like a hand. Was it betrayal to let another woman's presence warm the air she once breathed? Was he trying to bury his grief with another's company? He could not answer. Yet when he woke and found Anika already stoking the fire, her face calm in the glow. Something in him eased despite himself. Anika seemed to sense his conflict. Her eyes lingered on him sometimes, patient, questioning, but never pressing. She carried herself with the silence of someone who knew what it was to wait for acceptance, for belonging, for a place to put down roots that might not be torn away. The townsfolk noticed before Elias was ready to admit anything to himself. At the trading post, voices carried sharp. Men leaned on the counter, smirking, tossing words that cut without blade. Car's got himself an Indian bride now. Guess loneliness'll drive a man to strange company. Careful she don't put a knife in your back when you're asleep. Elias felt the heat rise in him, blood pounding in his ears. For months he had held his tongue, shouldered gossip like any other burden. But now, hearing her reduced to mockery, something in him snapped. He turned on them, eyes hard as gunmetal, voice low but burning. Say another word, and you'll swallow your teeth with it. The room went still. His hand hovered near his belt, though no weapon was drawn. Silence fell, uneasy and thick, until the men stepped back, muttering excuses. When Elias returned home that evening, Anika was waiting by the hearth. She did not ask what had happened, but she seemed to know. He sank into his chair, weary, jaw tight. For a long while the only sound was the fire popping. Then she rose, lifted the shawl from where it hung across the old rocking chair, and carried it to him. He stiffened, ready to protest, but her expression stopped him. With a care that was almost reverent, she draped the shawl over his shoulders. It carried the faint scent of smoke and lavender, the memory of another woman, another life. Yet now it rested upon him like something new, an offering, a bridge between what had been and what might be. Elias did not move. He did not shrug it off. His hand stayed folded in his lap as the shawl settled across him, as Anika's quiet claim touched both past and present at once. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a man alone in his house. And though he said nothing, his silence no longer carried rejection. It carried acceptance, though unspoken, fragile as spring's first bloom. The heat of summer came heavy across the prairie, the grass grown tall and brittle, the sky stretched wide with thunderclouds that never seemed to break. Elias worked the days slower now, sweat running down his neck, his hat brim soaked and darkened. Anika tended to the small patch of garden she had coaxed into life by the porch, herbs, beans, a few stubborn shoots of corn. The house no longer echoed with emptiness. It carried the scent of meals cooking, the murmur of chores done side by side, the quiet rhythm of two lives woven together though neither had named it. Yet unease lingered. The memory of the drifter never left. Elias found himself checking the rifle more often, oiling its barrel until the metal gleamed, setting it within easy reach when dusk fell. At night he lay listening, not only to coyotes at the ridge but to the silence between those calls, the silence that often carried the weight of waiting eyes. The threat came at last. One night, long after the sun had sunk, the sound of hooves thundered from the dark. Elias rose from his bed before the knock came. He opened the door to see torchlight in the distance, fire blooming where it had no business. The barn's roof caught first, dry timber blazing into the night sky. Figures moved against the glow, 3 of them, one he knew by the tilt of his shoulders, the shape of his gait. The drifter had returned, and he had not come alone. "Stay inside," Elias ordered, but Anika did not obey. She was already at the rifle, her hands steady, her eyes hard. The night broke open with shouts, with the crack of splintering wood, with firelight dancing across the fields. Elias took position by the fence, rifle at his shoulder. The drifter shouted curses, his voice thick with drink and rage, demanding Anika by name, swearing she was owed. Bullets snapped through the night, slamming into fence posts, sparking against the stone of the chimney. Elias fired back, his shots precise, driving the men to cover though they outnumbered him. Then Anika's voice rang out, not in fear, but in defiance. She fired from the doorway, the rifle bucking against her shoulder, her braid whipping in the wind. One of the men fell to the ground, clutching his leg, his torch snuffed in the dirt. The drifter swore, spitting rage into the smoke. A bullet grazed Elias's arm, tearing flesh. He staggered, breath hissing, but before he could falter Anika was at his side, dragging him back, pressing cloth to the wound even as the fight raged. Her hands were quick, sure, refusing to tremble. "You will not fall," she whispered fiercely, though her eyes burned with fear. Together they stood against the blaze. The barn collapsed inward, sparks rising to the heavens, but the house remained. Their gunfire carried into the night until, at last, the attackers faltered. The wounded man cried out, the others retreating into the darkness, their curses fading with the sound of hooves. Only the drifter lingered, his face lit by fire, hatred etched deep. But Elias raised his rifle once more, blood streaking his arm, his voice low and steady. "This is the last time." The word struck harder than any bullet. The drifter spat in the dirt, then turned his horse and vanished into the dark. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the burning barn. Elias and Anika stood side by side, smoke in their hair, sweat and ash streaking their faces. His wound bled still, but her hands bound it with strips torn from her own shawl. She looked at him then, not as a man she depended upon, but as one she had chosen to fight beside. When the flames sank to embers and the night grew quiet again, Elias sat heavy on the porch steps. He looked at the ruins of the barn, at the wreckage of timber and the blackened earth. Loss was no stranger to him. But this time he was not alone among the ashes. He turned to Anika, her face lit faintly by the dying fire. For so long words had failed him, his grief choking them before they could rise. But now they came, rough and halting, yet true. Life's too empty to live it alone. Too sacred not to share. Her eyes shone, wet with more than smoke. She touched his face, not gently, but firmly, as though anchoring him to the vow he had just spoken. "Then share it with me," she whispered. Not a plea, not a surrender, but a claim. Elias bowed his head. For the first time since his wife's passing, he did not feel torn between past and present. He felt whole, scarred though he was, standing beside a woman who had fought for their home as fiercely as he had. Together they watched the embers fade, the night closing in around them. The barn was gone, but the house stood firm. And within its walls, something greater than survival had been forged, something neither fire nor hatred could burn away. Morning came slow, its light spilling over the prairie as though the land itself had been scoured clean by fire and loss. The barn lay in ruin, charred timbers collapsed into themselves, but the house still stood, weathered and unyielding. Smoke lingered in the air, a reminder of the battle fought and won. Elias saddled his horse in silence, his arm bandaged, his movement stiff but sure. Anika watched from the porch, her braid catching the early sun, her eyes calm, though shadows lingered in them. They both knew the fire hadn't burned away everything. The drifter was gone, but whispers would remain, whispers waiting in town, in the eyes of men who had mocked her and tested him. Elias had avoided those stares for months, had let them eat at him in silence. But now there could be no more hiding, no more shrinking into the edges of life. If they were to build something real, it had to be built in the open. When Elias mounted his horse, he looked to Anika. She already held the reins of another, steady and unflinching. No words passed between them, but both understood. They would ride into town together. Not as strangers forced by storm or hunger, but as a man and woman who had fought side by side and chosen not to be divided. The ride was quiet, the prairie wind carrying the smell of grass and earth freshly dampened by last night's smoke. Elias sat straight in the saddle, though his wound tugged at him with every step. Anika rode beside him, her back strong, her braid shining dark against the sunlit sky. From a distance they looked almost ordinary, two riders heading into town. But in truth, every hoofbeat was a declaration, each step carrying the weight of defiance and survival. When they entered town, conversation slowed. Men leaned against posts, eyes narrowing, spitting into the dust. Women whispered near the mercantile, hands tightening on their baskets. A few faces turned away in scorn, but others lingered with something different, quiet respect, admiration too dangerous to show openly. The sheriff gave a slow nod as they passed, neither friendly nor cold, but acknowledging. Elias ignored the sneers, his gaze fixed ahead. He had nothing left to prove, nothing left to barter. By riding here with her, he had made his choice plain. Anika bore the silence with grace, her chin lifted, her eyes unyielding. If she felt the sting of judgment, she did not show it. The town could take its reckoning, their lives belonged to each other now, not to the whispers that circled dusty streets. They bought what was needed, nails, seed, a new axe head. Elias paid without hesitation, his broad hand steady as coins clinked on the counter. When Anika stepped forward to purchase cloth, the storekeep hesitated, then lowered his eyes and wrapped the bundle without a word. Little victories, Elias thought. Little reckonings. By the time they rode home, the tension of town was behind them, swallowed by the open land. The prairie stretched wide, forgiving, as if it had room for their bruises and their hope both. Life settled into rhythm again, quieter now, but fuller. Elias rose early to mend what was broken, his shed lined neat with tools sharpened and ready. Anika tended her garden, herbs curling green where once the porch had been barren. Together they shared the silence of mornings, coffee warming their hands, steam rising with the sun. At night they sat side by side in rocking chairs, hers a little too large for her frame, his creaking with the weight of years. But one evening Elias began carving a new chair. The shavings curled at his feet, pale against the dark earth. His hands moved with care, not in memory of what was lost, but in promise of what was still to come. When Anika found him there, she did not ask whom it was for. She only placed a hand on his shoulder and stayed, the sound of the knife against wood steady and certain. Twilight came soft over the land, painting the horizon in fire and fading gold. Elias and Anika stood together on the porch, framed against the sky. No words were spoken, for none were needed. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full, heavy with unspoken vows and the quiet strength of two souls who had once been broken and now stood whole, not apart but together. The prairie wind shifted, carrying the promise of tomorrow. Behind them, the house stood firm, weathered yet enduring. Before them, the horizon stretched wide, an endless road of sky and earth. And between the two, Elias and Anika remained, not abandoned souls anymore, but partners bound by storm, by fire, and by the simple, unyielding choice to share the long road home.